Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly update for April 29th, 2020. I'm Kevin Gosztola, the managing editor for Shadowproof.com. We have multiple stories involving prison whistleblowing today. But first, some housekeeping items from Brian.
Hello, everyone. Good to be with you again. I just wanted to remind you to please subscribe to the show if you're watching on YouTube. You can also catch us on Facebook. So if you're watching there, please make sure that you follow our page. And you can also follow us on Twitter. And I just wanted to remind folks that we are a reader-supported news organization. 100% of our funding comes from the small donations from viewers and readers like you. Right now, actually, we're in the process of raising some money for freelance to pay freelance journalists to do reporting on COVID-19. This is a very difficult time for journalists. A lot of them have seen freelance budgets shrink and their outlets close, and people need work. There's also a lot of good information out there that we need to dig up and put reporters to work going after those stories. So we have a fundraiser going. I'm sure Kevin will talk a bit more about it at the end of the show. But in any case, if you want to support our work and help us pay freelance writers to write for our website, please go to shadowproof.com/donate. Kevin, with that, let's dive into our first story here. We have a prison whistleblower at Carswell who says the BOP knowingly misled the public on the COVID-19 response. What's the story here?
Yes, and this was picked up by Vice, and the complaint was submitted to Republican Senator John Cornyn in Texas on behalf of more than 400 correctional workers on April 7th. And this person, her name is Regina Warren, and she is the president of AFGE Local 1006. So she represents these people who are part of this union. And she said that with FMC Carswell being the only female medical facility, this institution would experience a catastrophe, essentially, that it was known to BOP that they were exceptionally vulnerable. And at the time of this complaint, the Federal Medical Center had not imposed a complete lockdown yet, despite the press release from the Bureau of Prisons that prisoners would be, quote unquote, secured in their cells for 14 days to decrease the spread. It hadn't, it'd only been a modified change to the procedure. It wasn't a total lockdown. So she felt that left correctional workers vulnerable. The complaint also draws further attention to a case that has received some attention in the past week involving Andrea Circle Bear, who was the first woman prisoner to die in federal prison. She died 4 weeks after giving birth while on a ventilator. She was part of the Cheyenne River Sioux Indian Reservation in South Dakota, and informants targeted her in 2018, and she was arrested for purchasing 5 grams of meth. The Families Against Mandatory Minimums president put it this way, that nothing better demonstrates our mindless addiction to punishment more than the fact that in the midst of a global pandemic, our government moved a 30-year-old, she was 30 years old, a COVID vulnerable pregnant woman, not to a hospital or to her home, but to a federal prison. And so she was remanded into custody of U.S. Marshals Service immediately after she was sentenced. And I believe that was a few months ago. And so in the complaint, there's a section that deals with what happened when there was this first positive case. And as Warren outlines, the agency was aware that Andrea was a suspected symptomatic case on Saturday, March 28th, when she went out to a local hospital. They received the results that it was a positive case on April 4th. So on March 28th, she was sent back to the institution to be placed in isolation. The inmate's symptoms progressed, which caused her to go back to the hospital for admission on March 31st. Wednesday, then, the day after, the staff who had direct contact with the inmate had concerns and started emailing and called the agency on guidance regarding the suspected symptomatic case, which had been admitted to the hospital. The agency was given to the staff they were told to come to work because she had not tested positive as of yet. There were a total number of 6 officers and a nurse who treated this inmate during the time, and they continued to come to work daily until the inmate test result came back positive on April 4th. So for several days that she had symptoms, but the test hadn't come back, you had workers who were in and around her who had yet to go quarantine. Since then, all the staff mentioned, as of the time that this complaint was submitted, all the staff mentioned did go home to quarantine, except for the nurse. According to CDC guidelines, staff should have quarantined at the time they were exposed the first time with the symptomatic inmate. So all of those people were put at risk. And then on top of that, you had Andrea Circle Bear, who was in a prison when she shouldn't have been in a prison because she was going to be giving birth to a child. And you have this tragedy where she's dead and she gave birth to a baby, which is now going to be in the custody of her grandmother, and that child will not have a mother.
Thank you, Kevin, and I'm very appreciative that you brought up the Andrea Circle Bear story. I think it has so many different aspects to it that are just illustrative of how awful that entire system is. So I appreciate it. We have another story here from involving the Bureau of Prisons. We have reality winner denied release by a federal judge. What's going on here?
And this connects to our previous story because reality winner, for those who have been watching the show at home, you might know that she is incarcerated at Carswell. And so some of the stories we've been sharing in the past week have focused on the conditions within the prison. And so while this virus continues to spread and the Bureau of Prisons is not telling the truth about the extent of the spread in facilities, you had reality winner submit a request for a compassionate release in early April. And on Friday, April 24th, that request was denied by federal judge Randall Hall. We've covered this request. We talked about this extensively last week, but the ruling came a day after we recorded our weekly show. So let's just get into the decision for a few minutes here that was handed down and the reasoning behind it. Randall Hall said that Winner is in a, quote, medical prison, end quote, which is presumably better equipped than most to deal with any onset of COVID-19 in inmates. And so that was one thing that was touted as a reason why he was okay to reject this. Winner has not carried the burden of demonstrating that her specific medical conditions under the particular conditions of confinement at Carswell place her at risk substantial enough to justify early release. So he bought into the prosecutor's argument that she wasn't suffering from any of the medical conditions that have qualified people for release so far. I'll tell you that reality had told the judge that she suffered from respiratory illnesses, a history of having bronchitis, things like that, and also that she has an eating disorder and struggles with depression. And so those were things that were put forward to ask for compassionate release. The judge also repeated an argument put forward by the Justice Department that the court, he said, Winner's incongruous complaint that she is at greater risk because of the preventative measures undertaken by the prison in response to COVID-19. So he was pointing out that the argument that she made that the lockdown measures were contributing to her issues as far as her health was incongruous with the fact that she also wanted the prison to protect her from getting the virus. And I said something last week about how it kind of made her look a little neurotic in the sense that she was not thinking clearly, like they were trying to make it seem like she wasn't thinking clearly about all of this because obviously those preventative measures are there for her health. But of course, the problem is that those things that are being imposed on prisoners are making it more isolating and making it harder for them to exist. And so she's 34 months into her 63-month sentence at Carswell. And I'm going to read the last section that I wrote just to get into the psychology in my coverage of this that I put up at Shadowproof. I wrote that if Hall and the Justice Department truly cared about the well-being of prisoners during the pandemic, they would do more to release prisoners like Winter. Instead, they are clinging to the same callousness that defined their opposition to granting her bail before she accepted a plea agreement. In November 2017, Hall criminalized Winter's experience in the Air Force and treated Winter like she was a terrorist sympathizer and suggested she was interested in, quote, matters of the Taliban, end quote, and, quote, researched airline flights to Kurdistan and Erbil and work visas in Afghanistan, end quote, like she wanted to join the militant group. Hall insisted that Winter's skills as a linguist who knows Farsi, Dari, and Pashto would, quote, enable her to live and sustain herself in many Middle Eastern countries, end quote. The U.S. Attorney, Bobby Christine, who signed off on this filing and led her prosecution, celebrated her 63-month sentence as the longest received by a defendant for an unauthorized disclosure of national defense information to the media. So both Hall and the Justice Department are deeply prejudiced against Winter for the leak of classified information, for revealing this NSA report, which we've highlighted previously. And as a result, this hostility, I believe that's why the court rejected her request. We've seen other people who have made formal requests like this have them approved by courts. So I don't think it was outlandish for her to go to the court and try to ask for help. But it's the bare fact here is that there's an institutional prejudice against someone like Reality Winter.
Thank you, Kevin. And as I'm sure our viewers know, we will stay on the Reality Winter beat as we have. Appreciate your reporting. I want to move next to this story involving juvenile detention. We have former Juvenile Detention Center employee in Detroit area files whistleblower lawsuit. What have you got here?
Her name is Azanean Petty of Detroit, and Detroit has been horribly hit by the coronavirus, of course, disproportionately impacting Black residents in the area, as we've seen that the racial disparities reflected in a lot of areas in the United States. She was a specialist at the Wayne County Juvenile Detention Facility. She's 23 years old. She has a 4-month-old son, so she's a new mother. And according to the Detroit Free Press, she resigned on April 6th after she was told she could not wear a face mask to protect herself. She brought her own mask to work. Management at the facility then told her she could not wear her mask and gave her an N95 mask, but they made it clear she could not wear it where the juveniles were being held. And her attorney says, they quote, they indicated to my client that the purpose of the mask under their current order was just for her to use when she left the facility, when she went out to public spaces. So think about it. They gave her a mask and then they told her, well, you could just wear it out in public. So I guess the charity is nice if she didn't have her own mask, but she had her own mask. She brought her own mask to work. So she didn't need help getting a mask to go out in public. She needed to be able to wear the mask where she works in the Juvenile Detention Center. Her son was born with respiratory problems. Her parents have medical conditions that involve poor function of the lungs. And yet astoundingly, the lawsuit states, quote, in denying her request, the director of the medical division told Azanean that she was protected by God and that she had to have faith that she would be protected. The director of the medical division told Azanean that her mother had already lived her life and that she only needed to worry about financially taking care of her son. And it notes that her mom is only 49 years old. So even if you believe that older people, I mean, it's horrid. It's absolutely horrid. But even if you think that people in the 70 to 80-year-old range are to be sacrificed, which is very cold, her mom is far from being at the age of people who would be taken off ventilators if there was a lack of resources at a hospital. So it's absolutely crazy what this young woman is going through. But I think it probably speaks to some of the deep-seated racism in our country because you have someone telling this young woman that if she could just pray to God, everything might be okay.
Thanks, Kevin. We have a couple more stories here. This next one is involves the New York Attorney General, who suggests that Amazon violated labor law in firing a whistleblower. What's going on with this story?
When this happened and Christian Smalls was fired, it became a huge story. And so this shows that the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, their office responded to the firing, has done some investigating. NPR obtained a letter and covered it. And they conclude that Amazon likely broke New York's whistleblower laws by firing Christian Smalls, who they sought to make an example of and discredit in the press. Smalls was involved in a protest that demanded a facility on Staten Island close after cases of the coronavirus were confirmed. The AG's office suggested that Smalls' termination raised serious concern, quote, that Amazon may have discharged him in order to silence his complaints and send a threatening message to other employees that they should also keep quiet about any health and safety concerns, end quote. And the office also noted that they were looking into other examples of retaliation against workers. We know those are out there. We know there are people in tech who not only were they speaking out against COVID-19, but they had a history of challenging Amazon's climate policies and their failure to change their the way that they operate in order to be more to leave less of a carbon footprint. And so the office added that the office had learned that many workers are fearful about speaking out about their concerns following the termination of Mr. Smalls' employment. Well, success for Amazon executives, because that's probably the goal behind what they did to Smalls, to show other workers that they need not step forward and dissent. The office continued, "This is a particular dangerous message to send during a pandemic when chilling worker speech about health and safety practices could literally be a matter of life and death." Now, an Amazon spokesperson named Rachel Leidy said in a statement that the company respects workers' rights to protest. However, quote, "These rights do not provide blanket immunity against bad actions, particularly those that endanger the health, well-being, or safety of their colleagues." And what I have to say to that is that it seems like executives at Amazon are saying to workers, essentially, that there's a double standard. I mean, it seems like social distancing rules are expected to be obeyed if you are trying to call attention to abusive conditions at Amazon. But if you're simply doing your job, if you're just trying to get by, and then those rules may be lax. You may find yourself working in close to other employees who are not able to distance from you because they too have to move. They have to move around that warehouse in order to collect the items that are going to be shipped to people who have bought products from Amazon. So those rules are applied. They expect people to follow them if they're engaged in protests, but within the facilities, it's okay. We have to maximize business during this pandemic. So I think that I'm glad that the New York's office, the New York AG's office, is following this closely, looking into Amazon's mistreatment of workers. It's obviously clear that they have been retaliating against whistleblowers who are trying to expose working conditions.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm glad you've been staying on that story as well, as I feel like some of the media attention has dropped off since the initial clash that Smalls had with Amazon, and then Jay Carney sticking his foot in his mouth a few times thereafter. But I want to move on to our next and last story here, our Julian Assange segment of the show. I'm sure this is something that you will want to speak to as it has impacted your own work. But we have the judge postponed Julian Assange's extradition hearing. Catch us up on this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a personal stake in this. I was not interested in the choice that lay before me, which was I was going to have to choose my health or going to London to cover this important case in the middle of May. We had looked at a possibility of working with maybe a journalist on the ground in London to see if I could avoid traveling. But fortunately for us and for Julian Assange, we saw that the hearing was postponed. And there was a hearing that happened earlier in the week. This was on April 27th, and it outlined these arguments. The defense made these arguments to the judge about how his due process rights would be undermined. It's been extraordinarily difficult, if not entirely impossible, for Julian to do any work with his lawyers, any consulting with his lawyers during the time that the coronavirus has been spreading through the prison. Not to mention that there's a fear for his life, and he has made a request for bail to be put on home confinement and be tagged with electronically to spend time and not be in London, but they actually want the home confinement to take place outside of one of the hotspots in the UK. And so that was denied by the judge many days ago. And all of this evidence lay right before the judge. And I'm glad that she didn't disregard it. And so she made the right decision. The hearing has not been formally scheduled to another date. We don't know if it's going to be in the summer, maybe in like July or June, or if we're going to see this happen in November. But at the moment, we just know that it's not going to happen in May, which is good for all parties involved, including, I'd say, the prosecution, because they wanted to call a long list of witnesses to participate in the proceeding, and it would have been impossible for those people to come safely. They would have to travel from countries around the world. And, obviously the burden is on the defense to prove that the extradition should not happen. So to some degree, the prosecution would have benefited greatly if the judge would have pushed on with this. But I don't believe it was the position of the prosecution to hold this hearing. So it's kind of a non-event. It's not much of a news story, but this is the latest development in Julian Assange's case. And, it does mean that Julian is going to remain trapped in the Belmarsh prison. We'll continue to see that he's at risk, and he'll be there for an even longer amount of time. It delays the case. It means that this takes even longer. There are issues that entails. But obviously, this isn't even a good. I mean, there's really no good answer here because it's unsafe during a pandemic to proceed, and his due process rights are violated because you can't have public there in the courtroom, and you're also going to probably have to limit press to only those who are from the UK because you don't know what. I mean, I'm from the US. I mean, we are undercounting our numbers of coronavirus cases, so if I came to London, you might not know if I was asymptomatic or not. And I think you should be very skeptical if I had traveled to London as to whether I was a carrier of the virus or not. And that's something that everyone has to deal with. And that's why it's ultimately a good thing that we're going to wait to hold this hearing in Julian Assange's case.
Thank you, Kevin. Any final thoughts for today before we conclude this show?
Yeah, so I'm going to be doing a Assange Vigil event on the weekend on World Press Freedom Day, which is May 3rd. That's Sunday. And it's around 1 o'clock, I believe that's Eastern time. And so we'll be sharing that link. If you look for the Shadowproof account, we'll tell you how to get to that if you'd like to follow that stream. But I understand Ray McGovern is going to be joining me, and Cynthia McKinney and Elizabeth Voss is going to be joining as well. People who have written and covered Assange and spoken out are going to be doing this, and it's part of a network of events that happens on a regular basis for Assange. So we'll be highlighting some of the things that I have talked about on this show really on a regular basis, and it'll be a chance to be part of the community that is trying to get Assange sprung from the Belmarsh prison so he doesn't die in the facility. And then the other thing I'll add is that at Shadowproof right now, Brian may have some more details to share, but we are working on providing support to freelance journalists and writers during this crisis, which is also a journalism crisis. We are stepping up and we're raising money and we're matching donations to anyone who can support our work. We have at least 3 or 4 stories that are in the works, pitches that we're hoping to get approved, and then have those stories published on our site in the next week or 2. And I'm really excited about them. I'm looking forward to giving these writers, people we haven't published at Shadowproof before, I'm excited to work with them, and the possibility of collaborating them is really awesome to me. And so I thank everyone who's given so far. We've raised several $100s, and we had raised 1,000 or more a couple weeks ago when we first put out a call for some donations, and all of that money will be matched, and then we'll have a nice fund that we can use as a bit of a relief fund to give people work. And these are journalists that I promised you don't really have a place to go. If they could just turn to The Intercept or ProPublica or The Appeal or some other place, I'm sure that's where they would be going, and I'm sure that they would be doing that work. But there are a lot of people who have been laid off. I think the number of people who have been laid off in the journalism industry during this crisis is now exceeds 30,000. It's somewhere around 30 to 35,000 people in the United States. We've had people from outside the U.S. who have pitched us and asked us to publish stories. Right now, we're focusing on the United States, but maybe later we might be able to publish some more internationally focused stories. But we're going to start with people domestically in the U.S. and show some solidarity with them, pay them a little bit more than typically Shadowproof can afford on our tight budget, but we want to value their work, and we want to not say no to them. We want to be a space for them. We know there's a lot of places around right now that are saying no to journalists and writers. So if we can, we really want to say yes to the people who are coming to us with their ideas. So that's what I have to leave you with. And if any of you are able to throw a couple dollars our way this afternoon, that would be excellent, because it's going to give journalists, some of them who have absolutely no income right now, a chance to be published at Shadowproof.
That's right. And just to sum that up, if you give $5, it's like giving $10. If you give $10, it's like giving $20. So this is a really good time to give and to support journalists. We're going to double your donation. And like Kevin said, it's a lot of new writers we're working with. I'm really excited about that. And I think we have some good stories on the way. In fact, right after this, I'm going to go start editing one of them. So we will be very excited to share that with you all. Maybe we'll share some of the headlines and talk about them briefly at the end of next week's show, just to let you all know. And that's it for me. I appreciate you, Kevin, pulling the show together today. Just remind folks out there, wherever you're watching, Facebook, YouTube, make sure you're following us, and stay tuned till next week. We'll look forward to talking to you then. Be safe.